in the departments of Comparative Literature and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University, Professor Saul Zaret. Thank you, Professor Zaret.
It's great to be here. Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone to the Verbindungen Conference, which promises to be a rich couple of days of exchange and connection. I'm happy to represent the Center for Jewish Studies here at Harvard and the faculty's collective enthusiasm for this event, both in support of our tireless students and in service of the field. I want to particularly thank the organizing committee for putting this whole thing together. I've had nothing to do with it. They've done a lot of great work. I also want to thank the CJS staff for their support, and specifically to the ICLA Isaac Melech and Zalman Rickless Memorial Fund for supporting the conference. Yiddish studies can sometimes appear to be a small world, but it's really spread globally, as Carolyn just explained to us. Though sometimes it feels a bit thin, right? It's so many cultural institutions that she mentioned. A scholar can sometimes feel somewhat isolated in their work, especially inside these institutions that are much larger seemingly than Yiddish studies. But one of the great things about events like this and conferences like this, it enables us to realize the ways in which we can come together and the kinds of collective scholarship that might be possible along the way. And our keynote panel today, I think we have a model for precisely this kind of thing. The two speakers I think are well known to everyone here. I'll just mention them, of course, right at the top. Jessica Kurzane is an assistant instructional professor in Yiddish at the University of Chicago. And Karolina Szymaniak is an assistant professor in the Taube Department of Jewish Studies at the University of Wrocław. These are their titles, of course, but I think more importantly, these are people who are deeply committed to collaborative scholarship and creating scholarly community. Jessica is, of course, the editor-in-chief of InGeweb, a journal of Yiddish studies, the central address for Yiddish studies today and a site of constant collaborative innovation. She's also a celebrated translator, part of that collective that's ensuring the circulation of Yiddish women authors today, including her very recent translation of Miriam Karpilov's novel Judith that just came out with Farlag Press. Karolina is part of that same group of translators, arguably, into Polish, of course, from her work translating Doria Fogel and Rachel Auerbach, among many, many others. In addition to her prodigious scholarship, she too has spearheaded so many collective initiatives. It would be difficult to name them all, from anthologies and translations to art exhibits to her own magazine, Zwischen. So these are two scholars for whom the word network is not just something that's abstract, but a concrete strategy for creative work. And I know that we all look forward to their conversation today. And of course, moderating their discussion is Dalia Wolfson, a third-year doctoral student here at Harvard in the Comparative Literature Department. She too is no foreigner to Yiddish networks, having recently begun her tenure as the text and translation editor at InGeweb. So without further ado, I'll get out of everyone's way and turn the spotlight over to Jessica, who will begin our conversation today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Saul, for that introduction. I also want to begin with gratitude for the organizers for the conference, and gratitude for the networks, the Verbindungen that brought us together today. These are networks of early career Yiddishists working together to plan and create, networks of institutions supporting and circulating their work, a conference announcement that was shared across information highways and golden chains of mentors and friends to scholars sharing an interest in building Yiddish studies knowledge. It's really such an honor to speak alongside Karolina Szymaniak, a distinguished scholar whose work I have long admired, and also Dalia Wolfson, a dear new colleague of mine. There's a real pleasure in speaking to such a gathering, a pleasure that began with reading your names on a schedule and feeling the warm tinge of pride and recognition at the thought that people I know and whose work I know, students and colleagues, are sharing their ideas with one another, as well as the excitement of reading names not yet familiar, who I already feel bound to by virtue of our being here together in a shared effort to understand and foster Yiddish networks. If this were an in-person conference, I might have an opportunity to deepen these networks with informal conversations over coffee or lunch or in between sessions. But as Fregel Gertzovsky recently reminded us in a piece for InGeweb on online social spaces and Yiddishist communities, There are many digital ways to be together and to bring our full social selves to digital presentations. I hope you partake of them to share words of curiosity and encouragement with one another. My excitement about being here comes from the knowledge of the Verbindungen that I will now be able to have with the people in this audience, Verbindungen that I hope will extend beyond the formal presentation of my ideas. In thinking about the back of the lecture hall whispering and note passing that I hope will be happening throughout the virtual conference, I recall the first time that I listened to an archival recording from the Yiddish Book Center of a lecture held at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. It was an event that took place on February 5th, 1956, an evening celebrating the poetry of Ida Maza. I turned on the recording to hear a presentation about Maza's writing itself, but what I received was an education far beyond that. From the first moment that the recording clicked on, and I heard presenters fussing to see if it was working, I was immersed in a social context. I could hear the warm, low hum of audience chatter, the outbursts of clapping, and from time to time, an audience member coughing. This didn't distract, but instead focused my attention on the presentation as something that happened in an actual auditorium, reminding me that someone else, many someone else's, were listening along with me. The recording buzzed. The speaker moved closer and further away from the microphone. And it didn't matter because it's not me that he was addressing, but the people in the room. And the difficulties of listening to such a recording only serve to highlight the idea of audience, of Verbindungen, that was being enacted in such a moment, and that we only have distant access to, can only imagine. I heard children reciting Maza's poetry in fluid sing-song, with grown-ups chuckling their approval. A child sang Motela Motela, Lange Kapotela, off-key, straining for the high notes. Later, there were grown-up singers, piano players, letters of support and friendship read out loud, lectures, and finally, a reading by Ida Maza herself, her work now fully situated as something that she shared with an adoring public. Incidentals of the recording, the clinking of a glass, the muffled sounds of footsteps as a speaker stepped up to the mic, made clear what one of the speakers at the evening, poet and journalist Yisroel Stern, described explicitly in his own words. Als Künstler schafft, will als Emetzer soll im Herren, Sarah liegen die ganze Meise, als jeder schreibt für sich. Schreibt Takele hat viele für sich, was will sich ausdrücken, aber ein Künstler legt euch nicht bloß seine Gefühlen, nur die Gefühlen von der ganzen Dauer, von der ganzen Zeit. Und viele quetscht etwas mehr, is will soll im Herren, muss haben Svive. When an artist creates, he wants someone to hear him. He wants, of course, first of all, because there's something, he writes, of course, first of all, because there's something he wants to express for himself, but an artist does not just set down his own feelings, he expresses the feelings of a whole generation and a whole historical moment and even more. So he wants to be heard by someone. He must have a social context. Ida Maza didn't write her poetry alone in some much-deserved sacred room of one's own. She wrote it for a community, in a community, and when it was published, it was celebrated by her community, a community engaged in organizing literary evenings to celebrate their much-beloved writers and cultural activists. We all know this, that writers have audiences, both in person at events and also readers in their own homes or libraries or schools, and that they have friends and colleagues who support and interpret their work. But hearing them in a room together brings that home, makes our reality, having a conference about Yiddish networks, feel so much closer to the historical networks that are our subject of study. When we think about Yiddish networks, we might think about who is in the room, both in the front, lecturing, and in the audience, sipping tea and whispering to each other. Who is shaking hands with whom? Who is writing letters back and forth? Who is asking for or accepting someone's manuscript? Who is reviewing someone's work, whether canning it or praising it? Who is reading someone's work for pleasure, but deciding it doesn't merit a review? Sophia Schulson, one of the organizers of today's conference, might remind us to think about who is typing on what typewriter and where they got it from. Like Bluma Lempel, whose typewriter was a gift from newspaper editor Pesach Novik, and who used the object to escape into a literary text in the hours when her children were at school. We might think about who is staying at whose house, like Kadia Molodovsky spending time at the home of Chicago Yiddish poet Pesach Hirschfeld Pomerantz, or who couldn't join in, like Miriam Karpelov, who writes to Bertha Kling about how sorry she is to miss Kling's lively New York salon because she's stuck in sleepy Connecticut. These are the realities of Yiddish networks, and the details make those networks real for us. Sometimes those details are uplifting, and sometimes they are maddening. Here's one example taken from my own research. In June 1918, Miriam Karpelov, author of the then just published Diary of a Lonely Girl, attended a literary evening in Chicago organized by the local Poale Zion chapter in honor of the New York-based Yiddish poet Yehoyesh. In an article for the newspaper Die Wahrheit, Karpelov describes hundreds of people gathered in a banquet hall on a stiflingly hot summer evening, seated around a long table, waiting for their guest of honor, who it turns out is not dining with them after all. Karpelov writes, "So ist das, hat einer von sie nicht aufgehört zu teinen. Wir haben ihm gebracht und ist nicht bei unser Tisch gesessen. Zu die Reiche ist weg. Wir haben bedarf den Abend mit der ledigen Augen verbringen." That's how it goes, one of them was heard complaining nonstop. "We brought him here, but he couldn't be bothered to sit at our table. He went off to be with the rich people. We had to pass the evening with the seat of honor empty." Karpelov reflects wryly that the great names of New York were not more gracious in this hospitable, open-armed provincial town, and notes that local Chicago writers who were present at the event were overlooked by their community, who were too starstruck by New York Yiddish writers to pay enough attention to their own. Only after they have been let down by Yehoyesh did the attendees of the literary evening grumble to themselves, "What does he care about us? After all, he's the model of success." In this scene, Yehoyesh's throne sits empty in front of an audience, many of them writers themselves who might otherwise occupy it, among them Miriam Karpelov, who was by then a fairly well-known writer. Yet in his absence, it is Yehoyesh who the audience upholds, even by way of criticism, as the model of success. If indeed Yehoyesh in this story is a model of success, it is not simply his writing that makes him so. He has privileges that allow for him to be the kind of writer typically most well received in the world of Yiddish. His fame allows him to travel the lecture circuit, to earn money speaking about his writing. Relying on extensive and established networks of newspapers and theaters, writers like Yehoyesh participated in the export of New York Yiddish culture to other satellite areas like Detroit, Montreal, and Chicago, whose locally produced press and theater thereby lagged because of a reliance on the significant cultural influence of New York, making the 1956 celebration of Ida Maza in Montreal an unlikely occurrence in the 1918 Yiddish world of Chicago that Karpelov describes. And what makes Yehoyesh successful is not only that he is a New York writer come to tour the provinces, so is Miriam Karpelov after all, but that he is just the kind of writer, a serious male writer, that audiences want to listen to. There are privileges of gender, genre, and geography that allow for Yehoyesh's fame, and these are produced and replicated by the networks, newspapers, lecture circuits, and literary coteries in which he participates. My thinking about this is influenced by University of Wisconsin graduate student Aaron Fagan's work on American Yiddish provinces. We might think about models of success as something that communities of readers, writers, and publishers create collectively, in which particular writers are able to thrive, not only because of the strength of their writing, but because their success is bolstered by the models into which they fit. But if we look again at the Chicago scene Karpelov paints, we might read the same text as offering other models for success, a success from the margins of what already, we must remember, was a marginal literary community. The triumph of the wit of the person in control of the narrative. What does success look like, and who has it in Karpelov's account of Yehoyesh's Chicago visit? Surely it isn't Yehoyesh, whose face and whose poetry never appear in Karpelov's article. Rather than displaying Yehoyesh's poetic achievements, Karpelov's article is itself a successful example of the popular pedestrian genre of the feuilleton, or the talk of the town newspaper article. It enacts a coup in which the prosaic overtakes the poetic, simply because the poet failed to show up. The most successful figure in the text may be Karpelov herself, who, by framing the story as one about Yehoyesh's absence, undermines his authority as a literary role model, and with a wry tone dispenses advice about how literary figures and their communities should behave. Likewise, in foregrounding the audience's response to Yehoyesh's absence, Karpelov centers the community members whose gaze is fixed on New York writers, making them themselves an object of interest in their own right. Incidentally, what Karpelov would like to see is what came to pass decades later in the Ida Maza evening, the honoring of a local writer in her own community. Whether we're looking at Karpilov's cynical view on Yiddish networking in 1918, or the warm reception of Ida Maza within her own network in 1956, we see that networks are what make the Yiddish literary world go around, for better and for worse. An exploration of the networks that supported Miriam Karpilov in her writing career and where they fell short may help to illustrate this point as we consider how we might assess her role in Yiddish literature as a product of the advantages and deficiencies of her networks, alongside our assessment of her writing itself. In her late teens, upon immigrating to America from Minsk in 1905, Karpilov became secretary for the Bridgeport branch of Poiled Zion. Kalman Marmor, a fellow Poiled Zion activist, writer, and editor who was aiming to develop women writers for Der Yiddische Kämpfer, an organ of Poiled Zion, read Karpilov's secretarial reports of Poiled Zion activities and cultivated her in her creative writing efforts. Marmor encouraged her to write journalistic personal essays and descriptive pieces, and was instrumental in connecting her to the networks that would help her establish her career as a writer. From her correspondence, we can learn that Karpilov submitted her epistolary novel, Judith, to Kalman Marmor with some trepidation and doubt about its possible acceptance. Writing to her sister-in-law, Rebecca, about the manuscript when it's still under editorial consideration, she complains it could take Marmor up to a year to read it. He's terribly slow. Karpilov's sister, Dina, anxiously wrote to ask, "Has Marmor been to see you yet? You must know by now." Finally, Marmor delivered the news in person. Karpilov's manuscript had been accepted for publication by a small press, Meisel and Company, located on Grand Street. Hers would be the first book by a woman published by the press. This early success led to many others. Judith was a turning point in Karpilov's trajectory as a professional writer. Given his importance in Karpilov's early career, it should come as no surprise that in 1918, when Karpilov wrote about her visit to Chicago, she was not traveling a glamorous lecture circuit, nor had she been sent to the Midwest as a correspondent for a newspaper. She was in fact visiting her friend and supporter, Kalman Marmor, who lived at the time on Chicago's West Side. If we take Marmor's support and cultivation of Karpilov's writing career as a starting point, we see that networks from her early political involvement gave Karpilov access to an editor, to publication, and ultimately the opportunity to support herself with her writing. We might say that even if networks had a tendency to favor male writers, very often Karpilov was one of the only, if not the only woman working on the editorial staff of a Yiddish newspaper. Still, in Karpilov's case, networks worked in her favor, and without them, publication would not have been possible at all. But there were significant deficiencies in Karpilov's networks, and her archive intervenes to suggest that collegiality had its limits. Karpilov often lived with significant precarity, not knowing whether and where she might next be published. What are we to make, for instance, of the letters that she wrote to the New York-based Yud Peretz Writers Union when she was living in Tel Aviv in 1928? In them, she explains that she went to Tel Aviv with a verbal understanding from two newspapers that she would be able to send them writing about her environs and could make her living in Palestine as a correspondent for New York-based Yiddish newspapers. But the newspapers never accepted or published her writing about Palestine. She explains very angrily in this letter, and money became so tight that she had to return to the United States against her desires. And what are we to make of poet and essayist A. Almi's assertion in his memoirs that even though Abraham Kahan hired Karpilov to join the editorial staff of the Forverts in the 1930s, he gave a novel of hers that wasn't to his taste to Almi, asking him to complete it, as it had already begun to be serialized for several weeks in the Forverts. Almi writes about this to emphasize his refusal to take on work that he considered lowbrow or shunned. But from our vantage point, we might see the exchange as one of a breach of trust between editor and writer, an exploitative arrangement that makes it impossible to say that Karpilov was simply aided by her networks. Her networks themselves could at times be a hindrance. Working in a world of men, Karpilov was supported, tolerated, and discredited by her writerly networks. Networks made Karpilov's career possible and also set limits on it. A network of friendship and professionalism brought Karpilov to Chicago, not to speak before a large crowd, but to visit. Yet she made the most of it professionally, writing about her experiences for a newspaper in a way that would keep her rhetorically on top. Karpilov also had other kinds of networks beyond the professional. Her archive contains folder after folder of postcards to relatives, cousins, nieces and nephews, brothers and sisters. In these letters, she rehearses the self-reflection that would make its way into her published works, complaining that a date that she went on was a waste of time, or describing a summer that she retreated to be by the sea when the weather became unbearable. She lived with cousins in New York or with her brother in Bridgeport. She wrote about lonely, isolated people, but she gathered the strength to do so by living among friends. Often her social and professional networks were one and the same. Her close friend Rose Shomer Bachelis, who helped shop around her manuscripts when she was living abroad in Tel Aviv, and whose mother fondly called Miriam Karpelov Judith after the title character of her first novel, was also the president of the Women's Jewish Organization, for which Miriam Karpelov served on the executive board. But at other times, her networks were not directly instrumental to Karpelov's writerly success. Yet, as Karpelov cheerily congratulates a friend for cutting off her long hair into a fashionable bob, or laments missing a family funeral, one gets the sense of how deeply necessary these networks were to her emotional well-being, to her sense of herself as a person, to the social context that produced and sustained her. Perhaps these networks, just as much as any professional networks, were what made her writing possible. If we turn back to Karpelov's Chicago visit with these eyes, then the Yehoash evening almost fades from view entirely. Instead, this is what we see. On June 26, 1918, Miriam Karpelov, while visiting her friend Kalman Marmor, went to the Field Museum in Chicago and then had a very nice picnic in Jackson Park. There were sandwiches, eggs, pie, chocolate, and even hot coffee. Through a social visit, she was sustained. She experienced joy, and maybe this helped give her the motivation to continue to produce her energetic and comical writing. So she wasn't invited to give a lecture in Chicago. Maybe she was never invited to give a lecture anywhere. This doesn't mean that she didn't have a network. It just means we have to look to other moments to find her networks, as prominent or as prestigious as the kind offered to those writers more readily accepted as models of success. It's not lost on me that I'm talking to you about the ways that networks can be embraced and deployed when you're someone who isn't invited to give an important lecture, when I'm here giving a keynote address. The very idea that an early career non-tenure track professor like me, who has never published a scholarly monograph, could be asked to give a keynote suggests that the kinds of networks that you are creating in this conference are substantively different from the ones that Karpelov critiques in her Chicago piece. We can hope and build for a future in which such events and spaces proliferate, in which we can hear and learn from senior and junior scholars, graduate and undergraduate students, musicians, cultural activists, and translators in an expansive and generative way, so that there's not simply one coveted seat at the table, but so that we can all take turns at the microphone and the sound of our chatter and applause mingles. Thank you.
Should I just? Okay, so where am I? Oh, I'm here. Right, great. Okay, hi. Welcome to my Warsaw Mass. So this conference is also about connecting different continents, and I'm speaking to you here from Warsaw in Poland. And I want to start by thanking everybody who made this conference possible. Tumala Mershten, first of all, the organizers who came up with this wonderful idea, the speakers without whom this event wouldn't be possible, the chairs and professors who supported them, and Achren Choviv, last but not least, my keynote co-speaker, for an inspiring talk. And while I was preparing for this event and briefly exchanging emails with Jessica, I mean, this brought really fond memories of the first time we met in Vilna. And it's to Vilna that I want to bring you back today. But before I do that, I just thought about something that Professor Kizain also finished with. Recently, Professor Sol-Zarit reminded us that when we were Yiddish aspiranten, that means aspiring young scholars, such a conference was hard to imagine. And zum Glück, luckily, the academia has been changing since, and today we're in a different place. This conference is yet another witness to and an outcome of this process, early career scholars speak in their own voice, and this voice is heard. And it's also through different Verbindungen, through different connections that this is happening. I'm saying all of this, and again, this was inspired. This remark is inspired by the what Professor Kirzen said at the end of her talk, as one of the keynote speakers at your conference, and divided by a sort of symbolic mechitza that the very name keynote creates. But this is not a traditional keynote address. It's a keynote panel, first of all, and already in its form, in its very name, it's about being together across space and time zones, languages, and different academic cultures and different accents in English as well. And I feel it's an important move and an intervention into the way we do academia today. And this is what I want to speak more about today. And it's not only about us with Professor Kirzen being together on this panel. There are many people here among the presenters and in the audience whom I consider friends and my peers, people from whom I taught and from whom I have learned and keep learning. And perhaps I thought this anti-hierarchical trait of the Yiddishist scientific community today is owed to the fact, to the way the very field of Yiddish scholarship is constituted. As again today, perhaps not earlier, in more informal settings of the Zoomer program and Yiddish seminars and the social media. And perhaps this is something we could discuss later on. But this gathering reminds me also of something else, the open seminars that were organized by the Yiddish Scientific Institute, the YIVO, in the pre-war Vilnius, open to scholars, aspiranten, PhD students, teachers, and other people simply interested in the topic. So today I want to turn to this Vilna tradition, to this innovative Vilna tradition. And I am well aware that I am idealizing it to some extent and for a reason, I hope I'll be able to explain, and to think not only about the academic past, but also the present and the future. By referring to my own research on the Yiddish-Polish literary contacts or encounters, and using the conference theme Verbindungen, I also want to engage together with you during the discussion in a search for different terms that can help us conceptualize multilingual contexts of Yiddish culture, past and present. I say past and present, but my own case is in the past, but its ramifications might be important for the present as well. In April 1939, Yedias von YIVO, a newsletter produced by the YIVO Institute, informed its readers that a certain Mr., and I will say it in Polish, David Jakub Hoppenstand, moved to Vilna, where he had received a scholarship from the philological section of the YIVO to pursue his doctoral research on the trends and directions in the contemporary literary theory and to study Yiddish philology. The note added that on March 12th, and that year, Hoppenstand held a paper in YIVO entitled Linguistic Trends in Literary Theory. So one thing that is interesting here that you have this information about a PhD student coming to YIVO. And why was that? Why was it important? And again, I want to come back to what I started with. I mean, that voices of early career scholars are important. And that's why I'm bringing this Vilna tradition here to you today. But from the point of view of the Yiddish cultural history, this tiny little note is yet another, presents yet another obscure figure whose fate remains unknown. Probably it didn't draw much attention of most of the Yiddish readers back then and later on, unless they were specifically interested in the history of literary theory, or in literary theory if we are talking about the moment when this note was published. However, if we look at this press note from the point of view of the history of the Polish literary theory, this information is of crucial importance. We deal here with one of the most talented and innovative young theoreticians of his generation, that is David Hoppenstadt. At that time, Hoppenstadt was working on a monograph entitled Sociology of Literature. He developed a then experimental theory of discourse and proposed to study literary forms as forms of ideology. At that time, this was really an important intervention, not only into the field of Polish literary theory, but literary theory worldwide. And as Galin Tihanov convinced us, I hope, I mean, it was in Eastern Europe that the literary theory as we know it today was born. Hoppenstadt participated in this process. So this tiny little note of zero importance, so it seems, to the Yiddish scholars was, on the other hand, inaccessible to scholars of Polish literary theory, because it was only to be found in a newsletter of a Yiddish institution. Who would look there to understand something in the history of Polish literature or Polish literary theory? And here's the lesson. Here's the lesson I learned from this tiny little note, and from looking at the history of Yiddish Polish literary encounters. It's only through such Verbindungen. And here, Professor Kirzane was theorizing and presenting Verbindungen as networks. And this is a very important theoretical conceptualization, and you see my English here really doesn't help me, of the theme of the conference, but I want to propose something else here. So for me, Verbindungen are points or moments of contact that and through these tiny little moments of contact, we start seeing a broader picture. And that's what happened to me. I started to see a yet uncharted field of research. This is how this field emerged for me through this tiny little encounter. I was studying this note and trying to understand what actually happened. So this isn't a story not about finding a biographical information in Yiddish pertinent to the history of Polish literary theory. It's about a discovery of a new research topic through Verbindungen, through this moment of contact, through a connection that this note actually narrates. How so? Hoppenstadt's decision to leave Warsaw and move to Vilna to work at the YIVO is surprising for those who study Polish literary history. It was dictated by social and economic reasons. Hoppenstadt had no work in Warsaw, and anti-Semitism played a great role in him also being unable to find a job. Vilnius, on the other hand, was also one of the most important centers of the new School of Literary Studies in Poland, with Professor Manfred Kridl at the Stefan Batory University, and young scholars such as Rachela Gureviczówna, the later very famous here in Eastern Europe, Maria Renata Majenova, one of the best-known post-war Polish structuralists, or a name that will be more familiar to many of you, Dina Abramowiczówna, the famous YIVO librarian. Kridl, just to mention yet another Verbindung connection, was also a teacher of none other than Avrom Sutzkever, who studied Polish Romanticism with him. I am not aware of the exact context in which Hoppenstadt got the YIVO scholarship. Neither do I know if he actually spoke Yiddish. He came to learn Yiddish philology, so perhaps he was also simply learning the language. Weinreich might have heard Hoppenstadt in 1932 in Vilna, where he presented a paper on Polish Studies Circles Convention. This was a format that we are actually repeating right now. So this was a graduate and early career scholars conference, and they were presenting papers there. And Weinreich might have been attracted by the sociological interests of the Warsaw scholar, at that time Warsaw scholar, young scholar. But what actually happened? I mean, Weinreich heard Hoppenstadt, he invited him to Vilnius, he gave him a scholarship, and we're here. It's April 1939. So not much happened. So why I am bringing this example? I mean, for once, I explained that I discovered something more than this short moment of connection, short moment of contact. This story, however short and vague it is, can tell us something about the future the Yiddish leadership might have envisioned for the Yiddish philology that would combine formalist literary theory, ethnography, and sociology. It can also help us think about possible yet unfulfilled transformations of the field of Yiddish, but also Polish philologies through this Polish and Yiddish contact. This is a story that cannot be told because of the time when it happened. But for me, the story helped me uncover, as I told you, a new field of Yiddish literary theory, something that we could call perhaps a Yiddish theory. Simply, we speak about Russian theory, Polish theory, and so we can speak about Yiddish theory. And this is something until recently, few people actually believed that it existed. Uriel Weinreich was complaining about Yiddish literary criticism being so untheoretical. So here, looking at this moment of contact, connection between Polish and Yiddish philologies, we can see another possible way of development. Through a microanalysis of this moment of contact, I started discovering other scholars and their work that contributed to this emerging field, such as Esther Schindelman or Nachman Blumenthal. Schindelman, I guess, is totally unknown to most of you in the audience here. Nachman Blumenthal might be known to many of you as an early Holocaust historian. And he's probably better known to you thanks to wonderful work of Hannah Pauline Galay. But these scholars constitute a group of young theoreticians that contributed both to the field of Yiddish and Polish philologies. And it's only through this, to this moment of contact of Yiddish literary contact that we can see their work in an entirely different perspective. And they start to create another intellectual constellation that has not been described yet, neither in Yiddish nor in Polish scholarship. This is the lesson that we can learn from Verbindungen. And this lesson is also crucial for our theoretical thinking about the nature of cultural contact. So network, as I said, is one way of thinking about Verbindungen, but I want to really emphasize the nature, this non-continuous nature of cultural contact, that we really look at the separate points sometimes. And it's up to us to create, to verbind them, to connect them, and to see another set of moments, points of contact, or perhaps a network or a constellation. I'm thinking and I'm throwing at you those different terms because they, what's in a name? A name for me is very important because a constellation is more stable, a network is more flexible, and a set is yet something else. And these different conceptualizations, this is a word I cannot pronounce, really will have a bearing for the way we do our research. For me, this non-continuity is crucial here, and it also influences the way I think about my own writing, and that we can think about our own writing. We like to tell full stories or write more or less coherent monographs. In the academia, a monograph is something you have to produce. But here, what we are able to write is just a set of anecdotes sometimes, not full stories even. I call them close-ups. Close-ups that we connect into a heterogeneous whole, an academic montage or collage. And this montage or collage can be a fruit not only of an individual project, of course it can be, but it could be also imagined as a collaborative act of writing, of different scholars doing this together in this. My first really field of research was avant-garde. So I'm thinking about this new way of writing or doing academic research in this more avant-garde way. So to finish, I want to share with you one more important document and ask a set of new questions or maybe old questions. Okay, so here it is. Can you see this? I love this document for many different reasons. Just make it. All right. Look here, it's a Polish document, but it was written by none other than Max Weinreich, the director of the YIVA Institute. And what I want to point to is the spelling used here. So it's a totally Polish spelling. Before Weinreich became Weinreich, or I mean, even somewhere in between, he was using different spellings. So here his name is spelled the Polish way. And this is March 1925, and Max Weinreich responds to a warm letter by Jan Stanisław Bystroń, a prominent Polish ethnographer and sociologist, then the chair of ethnology and sociology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And he's sending him a copy of the second and third issue of Jiddische Philologia, together with a German summary of the first issue. He points to the need of establishing contacts between Polish and Yiddish philologies, not only in theory, but in actual practice, which becomes, and I quote here, all the more clear to Weinreich in the course of his own work. It is not only, says Weinreich, an ethical, but also an academic demand. A good knowledge of Polish philology can help scholars understand certain phenomena in the Yiddish philology or in the Yiddish language and literature, and vice versa. He then goes to ask, and this is what you see, this is the last line of the first part of the letter, what can be done to achieve it? What can be done actually to achieve this contact? What can be done to make this connection, to create this contact? And I want to take up Weinreich's question and to think about this Yiddish scholarship today. So what can be done to write Yiddish scholarship and with its multilingual and multicultural context, and what can be done about the power dynamics that is obvious in the field? Professor Kirzin was emphasizing different moments of domination and power, also tensions in the networks that she was describing. Obviously, when you're studying majority context, the power dynamics is very important. But here when we're talking about the Yiddish-Polish case, we're talking about power dynamics in a semi-peripheral field of power. So we're somewhere still on the periphery. And today, of course, the Yiddish academia is more about the American or the English speaking center. So what can be done to achieve more contact? And one obvious answer to this question is such gatherings in other seminars and lectures and moments of contact that we create. And the pandemic made it paradoxically, easier for us to connect across space and time zones. Translations, this is yet another answer to this question. But they are not so straightforward, of course, because we're not only translating texts, we're translating different academic cultures. So a Polish academic text that works perfectly in its original context, and it's funny, and it's engaging, and it's well written, and it has literary values, won't work so well when only translated into English. It needs to be rewritten or reworked to make the connection with another audience. Something that we as translators and scholars know very well, but this happens rarely. What else can be done? I want to just bring one more example that was suggested by somebody that I'm not sure is in the audience, but I'm thinking about Sandra Sore-Kiritescu and her borderless Yiddish syllables. So adding more different language, multilingual sources to our syllabi. This is something that can be achieved already at the undergraduate level, as the author of this project suggests. And then yet another thing, perhaps. So we can write our own projects and we can do our own monographs as we are told to by the way academia, I mean, by our prospective presidents or deans. But here's what we really need, I think, are more collaborative projects, not only anthologies, not only like these old style collaborative projects, but something really like thinking about new genres of research, other forms of doing research today. I don't have an answer how to do it. I mean, I have one idea for my specific Yiddish Polish project, but this is something we need to think. So so as you're changing the genre of a keynote address into a keynote panel, we need to think how to change the genres of in which we're actually presenting our academic research against the forms the neoliberal academia promotes, projects that are based on the economy of sharing or on the economy of Verbindungen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Szymaniak and Professor Kurzajn, for your incredible talks. There's so much to think about and so much to discuss. Thank you for opening this conversation on Verbindungen far and wide. We'll now move on to a period of around 20 minutes of facilitated conversation before moving on to a Q&A that will open up for the wider audience. You're welcome to begin asking questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them in approximately 20 minutes. And if you'd like to share your name and institutional affiliation, we can read that out as well. All right, so much to delve into. The first question that I'd like to discuss generally is speaking more about networks as a reading practice, as an interpretive practice, and a methodology. So I have questions for both of you that are slightly more literary and historical in nature, and you can feel free to address them in part or in full. So I'll read them. I'll read these first. Professor Kurzajn, with your talk, especially some questions that were coming up for me, we're thinking about, even though the tide has recently been turning in scholarship on this issue, one of the things that strikes me is that in traditional depictions of Yiddish women writers, they're depicted as these lonely ladies. And there's this pervasive loneliness, singularity, or isolation in the ways that these writers have been remembered or mythologized by others, or the ways even in which they themselves style their own behavior. One thinks about, and these are very disparate examples, but Stock's madness, or Margolin's uniqueness, or Lempel's retreat. So firstly, then there are these histories or mythologies of loneliness. And then there are also the depictions of loneliness, as Professor Kurzajn, you've pointed out. Loneliness can often be an experience of subjects in their fiction. In certain types of fiction, of protagonists in the writings of Jenta Serdatsky or Miriam Karpilov. And so my question is, first of all, what is gained from describing these individual, perhaps more ephemeral networks of these ostensibly lonely ladies in literary history? And in what ways do these networks cause us to rethink the characterization of lonely protagonists, where we find them in their fiction, in the fiction of individual authors, or to reconsider in general how we understand the literary thematization of loneliness? And And Professor Shimaniak, I think you open up so many tantalizing options for the possible yet unfulfilled futures of the Svilna tradition that you spoke of, and imagining new intellectual constellations for theories of Polish-Yiddish literary contact that have yet to be fully articulated. And this is also, in a way, a question for both of you, which is, how do these newly described networks in some ways reinscribe the actors that you describe either as marginal or as more central? Do they cause us to redraw the lines or the qualities of well-established networks that we take for granted, or form new ones altogether? Can we speak productively of any kinds of afterlives for these networks in the wake of either traumatic and abrupt stops, such as the Holocaust, or more gradual processes like American acculturation and language loss? And finally, I very much appreciated this sort of focus on terminology, and I'm curious to hear any more thoughts that you have on how the vocabulary around networks interacts with or rubs against conversations that we have about continuities, traditions, or legacies. And I'll open it up.
These are such great questions. I'm sort of scrambling to assemble some notes to respond to all of them. I'll just start by saying thank you so much to Carolina, because I'm also scrambling to write notes about everything that you just said. It's such a pleasure to learn from you. So thank you, both of you. Just a few thoughts, though I have, it's just the beginnings of some thoughts about these questions. With regard to women writers and how they are depicted and understood as lonely and isolated, I've been thinking about the idea of the lonely protagonist, Diary of a Lonely Girl, and so forth, and also, as you mentioned, in a lot of Jens Rudatsky's pieces, and thinking about how in this period, so many male protagonists are also lonely, right? We have this kind of lost generation, the lonely man walking around, Hirsch Naumburg's character who's considering suicide, right? Like there's kind of loneliness that is part of that literary world. And I think we have not questioned that not thought of it as a literary thing in the same way for women as we have for men. Maybe because their networks or their friendships are more obvious or more visual, or we've looked for them. And so we've sort of taken for granted that this is an autobiographical representation of these women. But we know, right, that Jens Rudatsky ran a soup kitchen, that she was actually like very enmeshed in a social world in the same way, the same kind of soup kitchen that Lamed Shapiro was running. And when we talk about, when you look at the scholarship, when you look at what people are saying about Lamed Shapiro, very much of it is about his kind of social environment and how dedicated he was to that social environment, and how he would not charge people because he wanted to stay up late at night talking to them. But so it's really, I think we have to take representation with a grain of salt, because what is to say that Jens Rudatsky wasn't doing the same thing and just her opinions were less, people cared about them less. I'm thinking about a telephone conversation that I had with Pessi Hirschfeld-Pomeranz's daughter, where she talked about Pessi Hirschfeld-Pomeranz having a desk in the corner and constantly sending letters, and how she was a poet, but the way that she understood herself, her occupation in the world, was primarily to write letters to people. And that actually the connections were the thing that mattered to her sort of most. And we have that, we're starting to see that with the blog of Bertha Kling's Salon. There's, I think, more and more attention to the social networks, and even maybe an understanding that women may have played even a larger role in that world than some men, because of the kind of emotional labor that women are often asked to take on, of keeping up social networks and family networks and so forth. So I do think that, pressing on it a little further kind of explodes the idea of women as lonely. But I do also want to say it is possible to go too far. I have been very tempted to represent Miriam Karpelov as someone who had these like really rich networks of connections with other women writers, because that's what I want for her. And so I go and I look and oh, she wrote to this one writer. She was so friendly with this one writer. They must have had these deep sort of connections and supported one another. But I actually am not finding that much in Miriam Karpelov to suggest that. I think that she was a kind of, maybe necessarily because of the nature of, being a woman writer in this period, she was kind of an independent individual who, I don't know that she had a lot of, close friends who were women who were writers who were writing together. She had some, but my sense is that wasn't actually as prominent as I would like to be. And so I want to be careful about reading my desires for who I want her to have been into my research about her. So that's my 2 cents about that question. I'll let Carolina respond and we can go from there.
Thank you. And thank you both. And yeah, these are very great questions, and we could probably spend several hours discussing them. So first of all, thinking about these dynamics of more marginal and central, how these, how this dynamic changes. And I'm also here guilty because I use the term periphery. And I feel like we really need to speak in totally different terms, that these are simply not useful, and that let's call it broadly, Verbindungen, that's your intervention into the field right now. I mean, you're the organizers and the speakers, the Verbindungen terminology, be it networks or, like encounters or different conceptual, I won't use this word, really different terms that we could use. They help us simply move beyond this binary logic this is simply not helpful. I've been asked not once, okay, so these figures you're studying, they're marginal, yes? So what is actually the contribution to the field? And it's not about being marginal or not. I mean, my point here is they're not seen because of them being on a cultural frontier, rather. But we could also use, the more traditional power vocabulary. Chaim Hayes, whom I'm studying, was the secretary of the Ethnographic Commission, of the YIVA Ethnographic Commission. Does it make him really marginal? And Hayes was also the first PhD, first doctor of ethnology promoted at the Stefan Batory University in Vilnius. Does it make him super marginal? I mean, even if we use this traditional, these traditional explanations, he is not marginal. He's not seen because of different reasons. And the methodology I'm engaging with, and some of you are also engaging with, helps us simply move beyond this logic, and we should drop marginal and central. Let's do that. And then of course it's our own language that we speak that betrays us, because I'm also tempted sometimes to use these words because they're shortcuts. They help us explain something very, very quickly. And the work we need to do, and the work that this conference encouraged me also to do, is just to start this search, a deeper search, like a broader search for a more inclusive vocabulary, and vocabulary that can help us actually describe the past in a better way, in a more dense and complex way, and to help us understand it better. And I think this is what also Professor Kirzeng was doing in her own talk, also explaining that we really, our visions of the past are so much simplified, and that Verbindungen, we make different connections with different points, and all of a sudden we see a very dense picture, very complex one that cannot be put into one. No one narrative is possible here. And then the afterlives. These afterlives of these encounters are very important because they are lost, especially after the Holocaust. I mean, the Polish Yiddish, for my specific case, there are different, of course, different contexts and different cultural contexts in encounters that can be studied, like American Yiddish encounters. This is a different case, but after the Holocaust, this Polish context is gradually, not immediately, lost also to the scholars who study those people and their contribution. And this is a case of Nachman Blumenthal, for example, who was also, I mean, marginal perhaps, but he was the first director of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw after the war, and an important figure in the early Holocaust research. Those scholars were for long also forgotten, and it's only now, thanks to such scholars as Laura Jokusz, that they were brought back to the field. And what we discover is actually how innovative their approach was and how we can use it. So one afterlife of these encounters is really a very productive knowledge, a knowledge that can inspire us. I mean, research approaches that are inspiring. And then again, something that is missing is how this knowledge was, I mean, produced, in what context. And this is the case of Blumenthal, who was really engaged in literary theory, and later on he studied the languages of destruction. And without this link, this literary theory link, simply his theory is less clear and we lose something. So bringing back these contexts, and this is the difficulty. This is why we need more collaborative work, because this world in which they lived and produced knowledge does not exist today. But we can bring scholars coming from different academic traditions, different linguistic traditions, different cultures, bring them together to uncover the full scope of their projects. And I think this is really of tremendous importance. But also these afterlives, for example, Dina Abramovich, I mean, please tell me that somebody interviewed her about her studies with Manfred Kriedel. I really would love to find this person, and I hope somebody did this actually, but nobody in Poland, that's for sure. Nobody, I mean, she was there, and nobody who was studying the history of Polish literary research I was actually interested in interviewing her. And I wonder if like a oral history that exists, I don't know about it. So if somebody knows, I'm really curious. If somebody was really asking of these questions, what was your, how you participated in this exciting moment where Polish literary theory was really being created. How do you see yourself there? I mean, today her name appears in different textbooks, but nobody can ask her about it. So these are also stories that were lost forever, if because of the questions we never asked, because we were not thinking about these people in those different contexts. So here's a partial answer to your wonderful questions. I feel like I will think about them more. And then terminology. I mean, I just really want to hear from others, because something that I'm using here is encounters and entanglement. And I was really playing and thinking for a time about using the term constellation, but I don't think it's productive for me for the time being. Network is, because it has so many meanings, and it's used also, I mean, helps us use many or mobilize many theories. I think also like actor network theory, and also engaged, for example, non-human actors, which is important, especially when we're doing archival research and thinking about objects as well, that also tell the story. I mean, this is something that also, we're connecting not only different people, but we're connecting, institutions, but objects as well, and other non-human agents. So network is productive, but I'm still, searching for something else. For the time being, I'm stuck with my encounter and entanglement, and that's what I'm using, and frontier. So these three combined help me, because they help me see these, those figures that I was talking about, and to uncover this tiny little moments of contact. And just I'll bring one more example, actually, how these archives contribute, not to our, which is obvious, to our research, but what can happen, like one object. I found the letter that I showed you in looking for something totally else, and the Weinreich's letters were used by somebody, probably not Bistron, to organize his archive, just into sort of folders. So I found them in just parts of these letters, parts and pieces, that these are not full letters. And simply by chance, because I'm stubborn and I look at every piece of paper that seems unimportant. And this is it. I mean, also the way archives are organized, they also influence the way we do research. And I mean, the archivist there, I mean, did not deem a Yiddish scholar so important to, to put him, to give him a separate folder. So he used these papers to organize other papers. And this happens in other archives as well. So archivists, but also archives as institutions, and archival documents as objects that we see or might, overlook, are important parts of this very complex network of different connections.
I want to point everyone to something that Mindel Cohen wrote for INGIVEB several years ago called Translating the Iceberg, Reflections on the Possibilities of INGIVEB's Text and Translation section, which where she starts to talk about what would need to be translated in order to fully and genuinely translate a text. And this is something that Carolina talked about as well, about how a word for word translation leaves out so much of the cultural context, so many of the connections that a text can bring, and the social context and the physical context and so forth. And that may be a kind of what Carolina was referring to as a kind of avant-garde model for academic research. Maybe that's something that INGIVEB is trying to do, which is to have these kind of notes from the archive that can then connect to texts and sort of build a world around figures or texts. And I think that's a model that we could build on, and that could take us much further in terms of both working with one another, right, to learn from one another, and also helping each other to situate texts, right, by building these different kinds of connections. And thinking about the word Verbindung and the word network, which made a lot of sense as I saw the call, because we've been hearing the word Verbindungen for 2 years, talking about, why my connection is not very good and I can't understand you over Zoom or something like that. But when I hear the word networks, my initial thought is about this kind of like graduate student moment when I was first going to conferences and saying to my friends, like, gee, I'm not very good at networking, I'm kind of shy, right? And this kind of like networking from a kind of business model of self-promotion, of trying to have, your own name heard for professionalization purposes. And I am inspired by the idea of a conference that pushes us past that asks us to, not think about networks as having to be about self-promotion, but networks as something that is more about genuine connections, either of knowledge or of people.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning this, and also this personal level that Verbindungen work on, because like Verbindung, a connection, is a relationship. It can be a personal relationship or a political one, an intimate or a social one. So these are really, this relational nature of Verbindungen is very important. It can be short-term, long-term, and they can be very complex. They are not always easy. And this is something Professor Kirsey was also pointing to in her lecture. They might, facilitate something or hinder something. So this ambiguous nature of Verbindung, connection, relationship, is very crucial here, but also bringing this personal level. And that's something I mentioned in our discussion before the conference. It's very important, because academia is still, very depersonalized. Feminist interventions into the academic field have changed it tremendously, but still there is a need for more relational relationships in the academia, and they don't make us weak, they make us stronger. And we are still taught, in different academic cultures, not to show the personal, but this is important, because this helps us also understand, talking about the personal context, the context where I come from, for example, the academic culture I come from, the language I come from, while I'm struggling with one word that I cannot pronounce. I mean, it's still important as well. And it's nothing we should be afraid of or ashamed of. It's simply something that makes us understand where we are and how we do what we do.
Yeah, I would say also it helps us to, I think it's good to be honest about our limitations. For instance, I don't speak Polish, right? So it would be impossible for me to access the kinds of archives that Carolina, that you can access. And if I were embarrassed about that, if I were afraid to talk about that, then I wouldn't have, I wouldn't be able to reach out and ask, right? And then, have the benefit of whatever I can glean from translations, from conversations and so forth, which would only further enrich the conversation. And so I think there's a desire to be sort of protective, which comes from this kind of hierarchy of networks, to say, I'm not good enough or whatever, that only actually serves to worsen the kind of scholarship that we can do. But I do want to say that it's like all well and good and easy for us to say, okay, well, the academic monograph is maybe a bit passé and we want to do something different. But there is a clout to the academic monograph. It means something for people's careers, and I don't want to discount that there are many people attending this call who are working on their dissertation, which maybe will become their monograph, and that is a structure in which we operate, and we have to do the best that we can with that.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Here in Eastern Europe, you have to even write one more monograph just to advance in your career. So your, dissertation turned into a monograph is not enough to advance. So it's a totally a more rigid structure. What I was just trying to make a plea for is a future academia where these, like I'm trying to think about my own future, and I have to write yet another monograph. And I will do this because these are the requirements, of course, of the structures I function in. But I'm trying to think about the possible futures and different genres we can operate in. And when you mentioned also in GiveWeb, I'm also thinking about the possibilities that digital humanities give us. And different genres they can engender. And perhaps this is, one way, because I think also, digital world has its really pluses, but also minuses, and we need these personal contacts as well. But I'm still thinking that these they help to, this kind of like, like in virtual text can be more connected and can be denser and connected to different texts and to different genres of actually research, because research can be done in different genres as we know today. It doesn't have to be a text, it can be something else. It can be a visual visualization, or even a concert, as Anna Sternschitz also convinced us. So connecting to these different genres and absorbing them is easier in this digitized or virtual way, which I think InGiveWeb has this model actually. It's open to these new genres, and it connects also very well between different texts and different genres that it encompasses here. And when you mentioned also translation, of course, here's yet another vocabulary we can use in context with Verbindung, the context of Verbindungen. So translation and any trans thing we can bring into the discussion, which also opens new perspectives for the research.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I do want to just signpost that we have around 14 minutes left, and we're excited to bring in some more voices to the conversation. So I wanted to remind our participants that you should feel free to drop questions into the Q&A. And I'd like to invite Sarah Biskowitz, who has our panelists' permissions to unmute herself and ask her question.
Thank you. I was wondering, Professor Kurzan, I read your recent review in InGiveWeb of Women Writing Jewish Modernity by Alison Schechter, and you had the line, "Is the impulse to institutionalize a certain mode of writing through its heirs ultimately a masculinist project of canon formation?" And I'm wondering if you you both have thoughts on this traditional ideas of literary canons within Yiddish literature and its contrast with other models and the intersection of gender.
I'll say that it was a genuine question. I really, it's something that I am asking without a real sense of having answers, which is what's at stake for saying that someone is an heir to someone else? Are we then building on this kind of idea of the Zayde and the Einikol of modern Yiddish literature? And does that foreclose actually the richer sense of networks that we're uncovering here, right? If there is just a strict through line from person A to person B to person C, as opposed to a kind of rich tapestry of people who are threaded to one another, is that an unhelpful way of looking at it? And does that come from a desire to legitimize, right? To say, okay, well, as Sholem Aleichem himself did, to try to make Yiddish literature on par with other literatures of that had a kind of clout, right? You have to have your founding fathers in order to have clout. But I'm not convinced that model is a correct one. I think that may be a one of developing prestige instead of one that that is true to the actual networks that people wrote in.
Yeah, we were struggling with the same question of canon when we were preparing an anthology of women Yiddish writers together with my colleagues, Professor Joanna Degler, earlier Professor Joanna Lisek, and Bella Schwarzman-Czarnota. And we were asking this question, I mean, are we canonizing? Should we use the word canon, the very word canon? And how do we need to legitimize it? So the way our move was just to start choosing texts that we simply liked. That was the first, I mean, the way we organized this anthology. Then we kept adding different authors for different reasons, but the core structure of the anthology was that of, pleasure and desire, I would say. So these were the authors that we liked. And this was not like, okay, we need, 5 Anna Margolins and 7, Kadia Moldovskis, and that's why this anthology, if you look at it, I mean, you have sometimes many poems by one author and then 2 poems by another, and it seems like, why? So the why is, of course, a legitimate question, and it could be, and it should be asked, actually. And also this choice should be criticized. Why not? But simply that was our way to approach the problem. And I don't have a question, a direct answer how to do it. And simply, like the proliferation of different canons perhaps is one way, but simply the very act of canonization is something that comes from the patriarchal culture as well. And I like, your idea of, like making simply, let's think about different ways and the networks and connections and make the image once again more, it's a texture. Let's think about it in different terms. So in our case, it was pleasure and desire that played a role and that helped us move farther with the project. Sometimes it was dangerous even because in this project, it took us 10 years to produce the book. So, I was 10 years younger when I started translating one author, and then 10 years later, after many different experiences and moments in my life, I felt like, why really did I choose to translate this poem? I don't like it. And we decided to leave it as it is because it was also a document of us reading and of, different moments in our lives that made these poems important then, and today perhaps not, but as a whole, it constitutes this texture, this of experiences. And I think this is one way to go, for us, and we should look for other ways around it. I totally agree.
Great, thank you. We have a question from David Kurkowski. He writes, thank you for a wonderful keynote panel. I wanted to follow up on Professor Shimaniak's call to decenter American academia in Yiddish studies. Can you talk a bit, for instance, about the University of Wrocław's own successes and perhaps challenges in bridging Western and Eastern European Yiddish studies?
Oh, that's tough. Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I don't know what to answer right now. Thank you, David, for this question. So yeah, Warsaw University. So so where I work and where I'm very lucky to work with a wonderful, really group of people, is a place that is one of the most important departments doing Yiddish studies today in Poland and in Europe. I'd say it's perhaps not for me to say this, but then I think really we succeeded in bringing Wrocław on a broader map of Yiddish studies. I mean, our audience mostly today are Polish students, are people who speak Polish, and actually, what I would be able to speak about successes and challenges and bridging Western and Eastern European Yiddish studies. I mean, today in our teaching, perhaps, because I mean, our students come from a different tradition. They're used to, reading and thinking about literature differently than, for example, the authors they read in English, because obviously they do read. I mean, they're supposed to know English, where we cannot German there or French, but this is for individual students. So English is the mandatory second language for them. And they encounter different traditions and different way of thinking about literature, different way of organizing texts, and different way of thinking what a, for example, monograph can be. And this is sometimes challenging for them also because they're thinking in another language and they're organizing their analysis in another tradition. So here sometimes we clash, or but we try to see how these. So we read a text by a Eastern European author and an American author and see how it works, how they look differently at the very same author, at the very or same text, and see how this can be enriching, and how these perspectives don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can be actually, we can embrace them both. So that's what I do when I teach modern Yiddish literature, for example. And I really organize the course around like thematic notes or questions, problems, and try to combine this. So this is what we do. But the challenge that is facing us that we are facing right now is we're opening an English language program, and this will be, I think, a great experiment in doing Yiddish studies in Eastern Europe in English. I think this is something that really will be a game changer for the program, but also for the students. And this program will be open to many different students, not only the Polish-speaking students. And we constructed it very differently, taking into account both academic traditions. And actually, we have a course, for example, called Theories of Yiddish Culture. Well, we actually thematize what David asked about. So these two traditions, so the Anglo-Saxon tradition and the Eastern European tradition in thinking about theory in general and about Yiddish theory in particular. So we actually embedded these questions and these challenges into the program, and we see how it works in the real life soon, hopefully. I haven't answered this question in full, but this is really an open question and a good one, but something we need to probably ask again and again and answer, each time differently.
Great, thank you. Thank you for these answers. We have only 4 minutes left, so I think we'll just wrap up with a brief final question as we head out to the rest of the conference. Perhaps thinking of bringing both of you up on the stage. Where do your networks intersect? Where could they be strengthened? And also, how has your sense of networks changed, especially in the last 2-3 years of this pandemic? And you can answer as briefly as associatively as you wish.
I don't even know. Okay, so one thing that I have been thinking about with regard to networks is that I'm a person who struggles a lot with imposter syndrome, as maybe I've even sort of alluded to in this conversation already. But I have found that networks intervene quite a bit in that for me. So even, in the beginnings of INGVEB, when I was still in graduate school, I remember when Saul Zaret invited me to be on the editorial board of INGVEB, and I came home quite incredulous and said to my family, I was at the time, I had a baby at home and I was writing my dissertation every other week and at home with the baby every other week. And it was like just sort of felt like I wasn't even all that connected to academia. And I remember saying like, well, of course I'm going to say yes, but he's crazy even for asking me, because like, I don't have the headspace to do this and I'm not, but it was his confidence in me that sort of brought me into the project and made it possible despite my own self-doubt. And so I would think about the way that networks don't have to be about the kind of like people feeling worse about themselves and embarrassed to talk to people, but instead bringing each other in. And I think that I've seen a lot of that during the pandemic, and people sort of reaching out over social media and in these online spaces and so forth, of trying to kind of democratize and not just make Yiddish accessible, but actively invite people into conversation with one another. And just one really quick thing, because I want to make sure Carolina can also talk, is that I wish that Carolina and I had more of a network and more connections, right? And this is like maybe an opportunity to really build on that and do more with that. As someone who not only is located in America, but works on American Yiddish writers, it can be difficult to build those connections. And there's also sort of language barriers in terms of scholarship and so forth. But one thing that we try to do in INGVEB, and I think we could do even more of it, is to review books that come out in languages that are not English, and that engage with scholars who we otherwise wouldn't necessarily get to hear from in an English language world. And I hope that we can do more and more of that to build those connections.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. We surely should do more networking, and in the good sense. Yeah, I was really thinking about the same thing. And just to briefly answer, and I'm very bad at answering briefly. First thing, I think like what I really mentioned for me, and I really started as a teenager. I went to Vilnius first, and I met there a PhD student at that time whose name was Joanna Lisek, today Professor Joanna Degler. And I was in Vilnius, and she created no distance between us. So I felt really accepted, included, and she would discuss Sutskever with me as a peer. And this and many, and support I really got from different people I met in Vilnius and during these, Yiddish on those Yiddishland islands, I'd say. So Zoomer program and other Yiddishist events helped me really very quickly. And God gave me courage as well. I was 22 when I came up with an idea to publish an anthology of Yiddish avant-garde. And there were people who supported me, and this initial support when I was already still a teenager, and people who embraced me, who wanted to listen to me, the people who invited me to speak about Avrom Sutskever and Polish poetry when I was 21, I think. And the same thing that Jessica mentioned, the encouragement. And I think and I hope that this discussion and this conference and people around you give you the same encouragement and the same support, because really this is through connections and through people who believe in you simply and help you connect to other people who can help you with your projects, that we can grow and we can see more and more wonderful projects emerge. And that's my hope for this conference and for you. And I'm looking forward to listening to all those wonderful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you, Professor Kurzan and Professor Siemoniak, for giving us so much to think about, both in terms of academic networks and in terms of literary networks, and new terminology as we jump into the conference. And thank you to all of those here, all of our participants, attendees, organizers. Thank you all for attending And we are very excited to open up the possibilities of forming new and exciting Verbindungen with you all. We invite you to join us in continuing this conversation over the next 2 days. We have 2 workshops coming up after a 30-minute break. And tomorrow we have 6 panels running from 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And you should see those links in your emails. Make sure to check your spam folder. And we look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.